The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Harrison estate, casting long shadows across the marble floors that Maria Santos had been polishing since dawn. Her calloused hands moved the cloth in practiced circles, each motion a testament to the 3 years she had spent maintaining every inch of this mansion. At 28, Maria had learned to move through these opulent rooms like a ghost, invisible to the family that employed her, yet essential to their daily comfort. Richard Harrison III stood at his office window, adjusting his Italian silk tie while reviewing the morning's financial reports on his tablet. The numbers were staggering, even by his standards. The technology merger he had orchestrated would add another $2 billion to his already massive fortune. At 42, Richard commanded respect in boardrooms across 3 continents, his sharp mind and ruthless business acumen having transformed his father's modest tech company into a global empire. "Maria," called Mrs. Harrison from the grand staircase, her voice carrying the authority that came with old money and social position. "Make sure the guest rooms are prepared. Richard's business associates from Tokyo arrived this afternoon." Maria nodded respectfully, though she knew the rooms had been ready since the previous evening. She had learned early in her employment that the Harrison family operated on a different wavelength, where perfection was expected and gratitude was rarely expressed. Her own background couldn't have been more different. Born in a small village in El Salvador, she had immigrated to the United States with nothing but determination and a fierce work ethic inherited from her grandmother. Richard barely acknowledged Maria's presence as she entered his office to clean. To him, she was simply part of the mansion's infrastructure, like the climate control system or the security cameras. He had no idea that Maria held a degree in engineering from the University of San Salvador, or that she sent most of her earnings back home to support her younger siblings' education. In Richard's world, people were categorized by their net worth and social connections, and domestic staff existed in a realm far below his notice. The afternoon brought the anticipated arrival of the Japanese investors, along with the controlled chaos that always accompanied high-stakes business meetings. Maria observed from the margins as Richard transformed into his public persona, charming, confident, and utterly commanding. She had witnessed countless such performances over the years, noting how he could shift between languages, cultural references, and business strategies with the fluency of someone born to wealth and privilege. "The wilderness retreat will provide the perfect setting for finalizing our agreement," Richard explained to his guests over lunch. "Complete privacy, no distractions, just pure focus on the deal." Maria paused in her service, catching fragments of their conversation. They were discussing a remote cabin in the Cascade Mountains, a property Richard had purchased years ago for exactly these types of high-level negotiations. The isolation that made it perfect for confidential business discussions also made it completely cut off from the outside world. As evening approached, Richard's security team made their final preparations for the weekend trip. Maria had been assigned to accompany the group to handle meal preparation and housekeeping at the mountain retreat. It was an unusual arrangement, as Richard typically relied on catering services for such events, but the sensitive nature of this particular deal required absolute discretion. "Remember," Richard's head of security briefed the small team, "this location is completely off-grid. No cell service, no internet, no outside contact until we return Sunday evening. Emergency satellite phone only for true emergencies." Maria packed her simple belongings, including the small first aid kit her grandmother had insisted she always carry. The old woman's voice echoed in her memory. "You never know when your skills might save a life." Maria's grandmother had been the village healer, teaching her granddaughter not just how to clean wounds and set bones, but how to remain calm under pressure and think clearly in crisis situations. The helicopter ride to the mountain retreat showcased the stunning beauty of the Pacific Northwest wilderness. Richard sat absorbed in his documents, occasionally speaking with his Japanese guests in their native language, a skill Maria hadn't expected from him. The dense forest stretched endlessly below them, broken only by the occasional clearing or mountain lake. The cabin itself was a masterpiece of rustic luxury, featuring hand-hewn logs, stone fireplaces, and windows that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding peaks. Despite its remote location, it boasted every modern amenity, from a generator-powered kitchen to a sophisticated security system. Maria quickly set about preparing the evening meal while the men settled into the main room for their initial discussions. "The market conditions couldn't be more favorable," Richard was explaining as Maria served their dinner. Our AI technology will revolutionize their manufacturing processes, giving them a decisive advantage over their competitors. The conversation continued late into the evening, with Maria moving quietly between the kitchen and dining areas, ensuring everyone's needs were met while remaining as unobtrusive as possible. She noticed the intensity in Richard's eyes, the way his voice carried absolute conviction about his company's capabilities. This wasn't just business to him, it was conquest, the thrill of building an empire one strategic move at a time. Saturday morning dawned crisp and clear, with the mountain air carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers. Richard was up early reviewing contracts on the covered porch, while his guests enjoyed a traditional Japanese breakfast that Maria had somehow managed to prepare despite the limited supplies. Her resourcefulness in adapting to unexpected challenges had been developed through years of making something from nothing, a skill that wealth couldn't buy. "Your household staff is remarkably capable," commented the lead Japanese investor, as Maria refilled his tea with precise movements. "Such attention to detail speaks well of your organizational abilities." Richard glanced up from his papers, seeing Maria as if for the first time. "Yes, she's been with the family for several years, very reliable." It was perhaps the most personal acknowledgement he had ever given her work, though still delivered with the casual detachment of someone commenting on a piece of furniture. The morning business session grew increasingly intense as they hammered out the final details of the merger. Maria could sense the undercurrents of tension, the careful dance of negotiation where billions of dollars hung in the balance. Richard's voice remained steady, but she noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his hands moved more deliberately, signs of pressure that his polished exterior couldn't entirely hide. Around noon, Richard suggested they take a break and explore the mountain trails. "Some fresh air will help clear our minds for the final negotiations," he announced. The group suited up for hiking, with and his security team establishing the route and safety protocols. Maria remained behind to clean the cabin and prepare lunch for their return. She had just finished organizing the kitchen when she heard the distant sound of the helicopter starting up. Looking out the window, she watched as it lifted off, heading back towards Seattle. The pilot would return Sunday evening for the pickup, leaving the group completely isolated until then. The afternoon passed quietly, with only the sounds of wind in the trees and the occasional bird call breaking the mountain silence. Maria used the time to inventory the supplies and plan meals for the remainder of their stay. She had developed an appreciation for the wilderness during her childhood in El Salvador, where her family often retreated to the mountains during political unrest. It was nearly 4 o'clock when she first heard the shouts echoing from the forest. At first, she thought it might be the men's voices carrying on the wind, perhaps celebrating some breakthrough in their negotiations. But as the sounds grew closer and more urgent, Maria realized something was wrong. Appeared at the edge of the clearing, his face grim and his radio crackling with static. "Base, we have a situation. Repeat, we have a situation." Maria stepped onto the porch, her heart beginning to race as she watched struggle with his equipment. "The satellite phone isn't working," he called out to her. "Something's jamming all our communications." Before Maria could respond, she heard Richard's voice from deeper in the forest, strained and commanding. "Help, we need help over here." Looked torn between staying with the communications equipment and heading back into the woods. "Stay here," he ordered Maria. "Don't leave this cabin under any circumstances." But as the security chief disappeared back into the tree line, Maria found herself alone with a decision that would test everything she thought she knew about courage, loyalty, and survival. The comfortable boundaries of her role as a domestic employee were about to be shattered by circumstances that would reveal the true measure of her character. The mountain wilderness, so beautiful and peaceful just moments before, suddenly seemed vast and threatening. Maria stood on the cabin porch, listening to the distant voices growing more urgent, knowing that whatever was happening in those woods would change everything for the small group of people now trapped together in this remote corner of the world. Her grandmother's words came back to her again. "When others panic, that is when your true strength must appear." Maria took a deep breath of the mountain air. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she gathered the first aid kit and a bottle of water, her nursing training from years ago suddenly flooding back to her consciousness. She had worked as a medical assistant in El Salvador before immigrating, skills she had never mentioned to the Harrison family because they had never asked about her background. Now, as urgent voices continued to echo from the forest, Those forgotten abilities might be the difference between life and death. Moving swiftly but carefully through the underbrush, Maria followed the trail markers that had established earlier. The dense canopy overhead filtered the late afternoon sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and shadow, making it difficult to navigate. Her heart pounded not just from exertion, but from the growing certainty that whatever had happened was serious enough to break the carefully planned schedule of Richard's billion-dollar negotiations. The voices grew clearer as she approached, and Maria could distinguish Richard's authoritative tone now edged with something she had never heard before, genuine fear. "Stay calm," he was saying. "Help is coming." Breaking through a cluster of pine trees, Maria found herself in a small clearing where the hiking group had apparently stopped for their break. The scene before her confirmed her worst fears. Mr. lay on the ground, his face pale and his breathing labored, while his colleague Mr. knelt beside him looking helpless. Richard stood nearby, his expensive hiking gear torn and dirty, his usual commanding presence reduced to that of a man completely out of his element. "What happened?" Maria asked, immediately dropping to her knees beside the injured man and beginning to assess his condition with the systematic approach she had learned years ago. "He collapsed about 10 minutes ago," Richard explained, his voice tight with stress. "We were discussing the merger terms when he suddenly grabbed his chest and went back to try the satellite phone." Maria's trained hands moved quickly over Mr., checking his pulse, examining his pupils, and listening to his breathing. The symptoms were concerning but not immediately life-threatening. "Has he mentioned any heart problems before? Any medications he takes?" Mr. spoke up in heavily accented English. "Son has high blood pressure, takes medicine every day, but forgot today in excitement of trip." "Where is his medication?" Maria asked urgently, already calculating how long they might need to keep him stable until help could arrive. "Back at cabin," Mr. replied, "in his luggage." Richard watched in amazement as Maria took charge of the situation with a competence he had never witnessed from her before. She wasn't the quiet, invisible domestic worker he thought he knew. Instead, she moved with the confidence of someone who had dealt with medical emergencies, her instructions clear and her demeanor calm despite the crisis. "Mr. Harrison, I need you to help me get him back to the cabin," Maria said, already working to position Mr. for safe transport. "Mister, can you run ahead and find his blood pressure medication? It should be in a prescription bottle." As they carefully lifted the semi-conscious businessman, Richard found himself following Maria's lead without question. The usual hierarchy of their relationship had completely dissolved in the face of the emergency. For the first time, he was seeing Maria as an individual with her own skills and knowledge, rather than simply as part of the mansion's staff. The trek back to the cabin felt endless, with frequent stops to check on Mister's condition and adjust their grip. Maria maintained a steady stream of reassuring words in both English and Spanish, drawing on every technique she remembered for keeping patients calm during transport. Richard, despite his exhaustion, found himself impressed by her composure under pressure. "You seem to know what you're doing," he said during one of their rest breaks. Maria glanced at him briefly before returning her attention to their patient. "I worked in medical clinic before coming to United States, not something that goes on job application for housekeeping." The simple statement hit Richard with unexpected force. He realized he had never asked Maria about her background, never shown any curiosity about her life before she began working for his family. She had been invisible to him, a function rather than a person, and only now was he beginning to understand how much he had missed. Back at the cabin, Mr. had located the blood pressure medication, and Maria immediately administered the proper dosage while monitoring Mr.'s vital signs. Her makeshift medical station on the cabin's dining table looked surprisingly professional, with supplies organized and patient positioned for optimal care. "His condition is stabilizing," Maria reported after 20 minutes of careful observation. "But he needs proper medical attention. We need to get him to a hospital tonight." Had returned from his failed attempts with the communications equipment, his frustration evident. "Everything's dead," he reported grimly. "Satellite phone, emergency beacon, even the GPS units are showing error messages. It's like something is actively blocking all electronic signals in this area." Richard felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "That's impossible. This isn't some random equipment failure." "No, sir, it's not," agreed. "Someone is jamming us deliberately. This whole thing might be a setup." The implications settled over the group like a heavy blanket. They were trapped in the wilderness with a sick man, no communication with the outside world, and the growing possibility that their isolation was not accidental. Richard's mind raced through the business enemies who might orchestrate such a scenario, the competitors who would benefit from disrupting his merger negotiations. "How long until the helicopter returns?" Maria asked, still monitoring Mister's pulse. "Not until tomorrow evening," Richard replied, the weight of their situation becoming clearer. "We told them we didn't want any interruptions." As darkness began to fall over the mountain retreat, Maria organized the cabin's resources with military efficiency. She established a proper medical area for Mr., rationed their food supplies, and even checked the security system to ensure they were as safe as possible under the circumstances. "You're full of surprises," Richard commented, watching her work. "I had no idea you had medical training." Maria paused in her tasks, meeting his eyes directly for perhaps the first time since she had begun working for his family. "There's a lot you don't know about the people who work for you, Mr. Harrison. Most employers don't ask." The observation stung because it was true. Richard prided himself on being thorough in business, on knowing every detail that could affect his deals, yet he had remained completely ignorant about the woman who had been in his home for 3 years. It was a blind spot that was now being exposed in the most dramatic way possible. Throughout the evening, Maria maintained her vigil over Mr., while the others attempted to restore communications or find alternative ways to signal for help. Her calm competence became the anchor that held the group together as their situation grew more uncertain. "My grandmother always said that crisis reveals who people really are," Maria mentioned quietly as she checked Mister's temperature. "Rich or poor, educated or simple, when everything goes wrong, you see what someone is truly made of." Richard found himself thinking about those words as he watched Maria work. Everything about their current situation was stripping away the normal social barriers and revealing uncomfortable truths. He was seeing Maria as a capable, intelligent woman for the first time, while simultaneously confronting his own helplessness outside the boardroom environment where he usually dominated. Near midnight, Mister's condition took a turn for the worse. His blood pressure spiked despite the medication, and he began experiencing chest pains that made Maria deeply concerned. "We can't wait until tomorrow evening," she told the group. "He needs hospital care now." "But how?" Mister asked desperately. "No telephone, no radio, no way to call for help." Maria stood quietly for a moment, her mind working through possibilities that the others hadn't considered. She walked to the cabin's large window and stared out at the moonlit forest, calculating distances and remembering details from their helicopter flight earlier. "There's a ranger station about 15 miles southeast of here," she said finally. "I saw it when we flew in. If someone could reach it, they would have radio contact with emergency services." Shook his head immediately. "Too dangerous. 15 miles through wilderness at night with no proper equipment and no guarantee the ranger station is even staffed." "Then we watch Mr. die while we wait for help that might come too late," Maria replied simply. The stark choice hung in the air between them. Richard found himself studying Maria's profile in the moonlight, seeing determination in the set of her shoulders that reminded him of his own attitude when facing impossible business challenges. But this wasn't about money or market share. This was about human life, and the stakes were higher than any deal he had ever negotiated. "I'll go," Richard announced suddenly, surprising everyone, including himself. "I caused this situation by bringing everyone here. I should be the one to take the risk." Maria turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "With respect, Mr. Harrison, you don't know these mountains and you've never done wilderness navigation. You'd be lost within an hour." "Then what do you suggest?" Richard asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew her answer. "I go," Maria said quietly. "I grew up in mountains similar to these. I know how to move at night, how to find direction by stars, how to travel safely through difficult terrain. And," she added with a slight smile, "I'm probably in better physical condition than anyone else here." The last comment was undeniably true. While Richard and his guests spent their days in offices and boardrooms, Maria had been maintaining a large household through physical labor. Her strength and endurance had been developed through years of real work, not expensive gym memberships. "Absolutely not," Richard said firmly. "I can't ask you to risk your life for us." Maria's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. "You're not asking me, Mr. Harrison. I'm telling you what needs to be done. And for once, your money and your position don't matter. Out here, survival depends on skill and courage, not bank accounts." The challenge in her words was unmistakable, and Richard found himself facing a woman whose true character was finally being revealed. She wasn't asking for perm. Maria spent the next hour preparing for her journey with the same methodical precision she brought to every task. She studied the topographical maps Richard had brought for the hiking expedition, memorizing landmarks and calculating the most efficient route to the ranger station. Her grandmother's teachings about mountain navigation came flooding back: how to read the stars, how to use wind patterns and water sounds to maintain direction, how to move safely through unknown terrain in darkness. "Take this," Richard said, offering her his expensive GPS watch. "It might help with navigation." Maria shook her head, holding up the device to show its blank screen. "Whatever is jamming our communications killed the GPS too. I'll use older methods, ones that don't depend on satellites or electronics." She packed light but smart: water, some high-energy food, a knife, the first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. Her regular work clothes would serve better than expensive hiking gear for moving quietly through the forest. Everything about her preparation showed an understanding of wilderness survival that none of the wealthy men possessed. "Maria," Richard said as she checked her supplies one final time, "I want you to know that if you do this when we get back, things will be different. I should have recognized your abilities long ago." She paused in her preparations, looking at him with an expression that mixed skepticism with something that might have been hope. "Mr. Harrison, people make many promises when they're scared. Most get forgotten when the crisis passes." "Not this one," Richard replied, and something in his voice convinced her that he meant it. Mr. stirred on the makeshift medical bed, his condition clearly deteriorating despite Maria's care. Time was running out, and everyone in the cabin knew it. Maria took a final look at her patient, checking his pulse and breathing, then gave Mr. detailed instructions for monitoring his condition during her absence. "Keep him warm, give him small sips of water if he's conscious, and watch for any changes in his breathing pattern," she instructed. "If he gets worse, there's nothing more you can do until help arrives." Pulled Maria aside as she prepared to leave. "This is a military-level operation you're attempting," he said quietly. 15 miles through hostile terrain at night with no backup and no communication. Special forces train for months before attempting missions like this." Maria met his eyes steadily. "Mister, I survived 3 years of civil war in El Salvador, including 6 months hiding in mountains while soldiers searched for my family. This is difficult, but it's not impossible." The revelation stunned everyone who heard it. Maria's calm competence suddenly made sense. She wasn't just a maid who happened to have medical training. She was a survivor who had faced life-and-death situations before and developed the skills necessary to overcome them. "Why didn't you ever tell us?" Richard asked. "Because you never asked," Maria replied simply. "And because most employers prefer to think of domestic workers as people with no history, no complications, no stories of their own." As Maria prepared to step into the darkness, Richard found himself seeing her with completely new eyes. The quiet woman who had moved through his house like a shadow was actually someone whose life experiences dwarfed his own in terms of real courage and survival skills. Everything he had thought he knew about her had been based on assumptions rather than actual knowledge. "One more thing," Maria said, turning back to the group. "If I don't return by dawn, don't send anyone after me. Focus on keeping Mr. alive until the helicopter arrives tomorrow night." With that, she disappeared into the forest with the silent grace of someone who knew how to move unseen. The remaining men stood at the cabin windows, watching until even the faint sound of her movement faded into the mountain silence. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Richard found himself unable to sleep, packing the cabin and checking on Mr. while replaying every interaction he had ever had with Maria. He realized that in 3 years of employment, he had never asked her about her family, her background, her goals, or her dreams. She had been invisible to him, and now she was risking her life to save them all. "She's remarkable," Mr. commented during one of their quiet conversations. "In Japan, we have great respect for people who show such loyalty and courage." "I don't think this is about loyalty," Richard replied, watching the dark forest through the window. I think this is about who she is as a person. She would do this for anyone who needed help. Nodded agreement. Some people are natural warriors. They fight not because they hate what's in front of them, but because they love what's behind them. Your maid is protecting all of us because that's how she's built. The comment made Richard think about his own motivations in business and life. He fought to win, to accumulate wealth and power, to prove his superiority over competitors. But Maria was fighting to save lives, asking for nothing in return except the satisfaction of doing what was right. The contrast was humbling. Dawn broke with no sign of Maria's return, and Mister's condition remained critical but stable. Richard found himself alternating between worry for Maria's safety and admiration for her courage. Whether she succeeded or failed, she had already accomplished something that money couldn't buy. She had revealed the true measure of her character under the most extreme circumstances. Around 8 in the morning, they heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the southeast. Grabbed binoculars and confirmed what they all hoped. It was a medical evacuation helicopter, followed by a second aircraft that appeared to be carrying law enforcement personnel. She did it, Richard said quietly, feeling a combination of relief and profound respect. Somehow, she actually did it. The helicopters landed in the cabin's clearing, and paramedics immediately took charge of Mister's care. Behind them came Forest Service Rangers and FBI agents who had been called in to investigate the communications jamming. It turned out that a corporate espionage team had been using sophisticated electronic warfare equipment to isolate Richard's group, planning to extract sensitive merger information through various forms of coercion. "Where's the woman who made it to our station?" asked the lead ranger. "She was in pretty rough shape when she arrived, but she refused medical attention until we got this rescue operation launched." Richard's heart clenched with concern. "Is she all right?" "Exhausted, dehydrated, and she's got some cuts and bruises from moving through the forest at night, but she's tough as nails. She covered 15 miles of mountain terrain in less than 6 hours, most of it in complete darkness. That's remarkable by any standard." When the second helicopter delivered Maria back to the cabin, Richard barely recognized her. Her clothes were torn, her hands were scraped and bloodied from climbing over rocks and through brambles, and exhaustion was written in every line of her face. But her eyes were clear and determined, focused immediately on checking Mister's condition as the paramedics prepared him for transport. "Thank you," Richard said simply as she walked past him toward the medical team. "Thank you for saving all our lives." Maria paused, looking at him with an expression that seemed to weigh his words for sincerity. "I did what needed to be done, Mr. Harrison, just like I always do." But something in her tone suggested that she understood this experience had changed things between them fundamentally. The old relationship of employer and invisible employee had been destroyed by the crisis, replaced by something based on mutual respect and genuine recognition of each other's worth. 2 weeks later, Richard sat in his office reviewing a very different kind of document than his usual business contracts. It was a comprehensive scholarship program that would provide full educational funding for the children of all his household employees, along with significant raises and improved working conditions for the staff themselves. Maria knocked on his office door, no longer moving through his home like a ghost. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Harrison?" "Yes," Richard said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk, the first time he had ever offered her a seat in his office. "I wanted to discuss your future with the family." Maria sat down, her posture alert but not subservient. The woman who had emerged from the mountain crisis was confident and self-possessed in ways that couldn't be hidden anymore. "I'm offering you the position of household manager," Richard continued, "with full authority over all domestic operations, a salary commensurate with your actual abilities, and educational support if you want to pursue additional certifications." Maria was quiet for a moment, considering the offer. "Why, Mr. Harrison? Because you feel guilty about how you treated me before." Richard met her direct gaze honestly. "Partly, yes, but mostly because I finally understand that you're exactly the kind of person I want working with my family, someone with intelligence, courage, and integrity, someone who does the right thing even when it's difficult." "And if I prefer to find other employment?" Maria asked. "Now that you know who I really am, would you provide honest references about my capabilities?" "Absolutely," Richard replied without hesitation. "Though I hope you'll consider staying. I think we could both learn a great deal from working together as equals." Maria smiled then, the first genuine smile Richard had ever seen from her. "Equals, Mr. Harrison? That would be something new." "A lot of things are new now," Richard admitted. "That night in the mountains changed how I see many things. Mostly, it changed how I see people, really see them, instead of just categorizing them by their apparent function in my life." As Maria left his office to consider his offer, Richard turned back to the window that overlooked his estate's grounds. The view was the same as always, but his perspective had been fundamentally altered by understanding what real courage looked like when it mattered most. The merger with the Japanese firm had eventually proceeded successfully, with Mr. making a full recovery and expressing profound gratitude for the care he had received. But for Richard, the most valuable outcome of that weekend wasn't measured in dollars or market share. It was the recognition that true worth couldn't be bought, only revealed through character and action when everything else was stripped away. In the end, it had taken being bound in the woods with a life-or-death crisis to show a billionaire that the most valuable person in his employ had been invisible to him for years, not because she lacked worth, but because he had never bothered to truly look or waiting for orders. She was taking charge of a situation that required exactly the kind of courage and capability that wealth couldn't purchase. Her mind already beginning to calculate possibilities and prepare for whatever crisis was unfolding beyond the tree line.